Hello and thanks for joining us on Chicago Tonight. I'm Brandis Friedman.
And I'm Paris Schutz. Here's what we're looking at. Trump is indicted again, this time for alleged activities surrounding January 6th and 4 charges related to attempts to overturn the 2020 election.
Northwestern taps a former U.S. Attorney General to lead an internal investigation following the school's hazing scandal.
New efforts to protect the hundreds of thousands of temp workers in Illinois and move them to permanent jobs.
And more than 100 tornadoes this year alone. Why Illinois leads the country in twisters.
And now our top story tonight. Former President Trump is indicted by a federal grand jury on 4 felony counts connected to attempts to overturn the 2020 election that he lost. It's the latest in Trump's growing legal woes, who is facing federal criminal charges related to the Mar-a-Lago documents probe, state charges related to alleged hush money payments in New York, and potential state election charges in Georgia. And here is special counsel Jack Smith just moments ago on today's historic indictment.
The attack on our nation's capital on January 6, 2021, was an unprecedented assault on the seat of American democracy. As described in the indictment, it was fueled by lies. Lies by the defendant targeted at obstructing a bedrock function of the U.S. government, the nation's process of collecting, counting, and certifying the results of the presidential election.
And here to break down this bombshell news this evening, former federal prosecutor Renato Mariotti. He's also a legal commentator, columnist, and a trial lawyer. Renato, thanks for being with us. So let's run down the charges here for the viewers. Conspiracy to defraud the United States, 2 counts of tampering with witness, victim, or informant, and conspiracy against the rights of citizens. Explain the gravity of these charges.
Well, obviously, they're incredibly serious. These are all felony charges. And what I would just say is that, the gravity in my mind, Paris, goes beyond any legal analysis I can give you. In other words, Donald Trump is already facing serious felony charges in 2 different indictments. I actually think my analysis would be that the Mar-a-Lago indictment in many ways is stronger as a matter of evidence. Certainly, he may face more years in prison from that. But this, of course, has a historic magnitude and gravity that all of those other cases just do not match.
As the special counsel said, it gets to the heart of American democracy and free and fair elections. So how important is proving intent here? Could Trump defend himself by saying, but I thought I won the election and people told me that I won the election, even though the overwhelming amount of folks that would know said, no, the election was clear, you lost, and there's no credible evidence otherwise?
Yeah, that's going to be, I think, central to Trump's defense. Central to Trump's defense is that he thought legitimately that there was fraud in the election. He was trying to legitimately investigate those issues. And if you read the indictment, which is long, I've been trying my best to read through it, over the past hour or so, the special counsel goes to great length to show all of the different ways in which Trump actually knew that this was a falsehood, and both from his own vice president. And apparently, one of the new revelations is that Trump told his vice president, "You're too honest," but also from his attorney general and others in the Justice Department and many other officials that were working for him and with him.
And indeed, that is a standout quote there, that allegation that he told the former vice president that he's too honest. But it does seem like there's at least overwhelming evidence that any reasonable person would have known the results of the election. It's also very interesting. There are 6 co-conspirators that are unindicted, but they're very central to these alleged schemes. So do you think that makes them cooperators?
No, I don't think so. For example, I think it's pretty obvious co-conspirator number 1 is Rudy Giuliani. I don't think he's cooperating against Donald Trump. I actually think Jack Smith made a calculation that in D.C. he might get to trial in a way and with the speed that he's not able to do in Florida, given that the Florida case, the Mar-a-Lago case, has so many classified documents involved. So he decided to have the leanest, most narrow indictment possible on these charges in order to try to speed his way to a trial before the election season.
And that's what he said. He is intending to go for a speedy trial. Trump and his supporters, of course, have put forth the messaging that this is quote-unquote election interference. It's coming right now because allegedly folks want to interfere with him and his frontrunner status in the Republican Party. Beyond these kind of messaging tactics, do you see any coherent defense strategy, legal defense strategy from the Trump team, either in this or the Mar-a-Lago documents case to this point?
That's an interesting question, Paris. I do think the defense is going to try to inject that into the trial. What I expect is that there's going to be motions that are filed before the trial. The prosecutors say that that sort of argument and discussion is not relevant to anything and it doesn't make anything more or less true in terms of the case, which is accurate. And so the judge might exclude that discussion, but I expect the defense to nonetheless find ways to inject that into the trial. I think that's swirling around here. I think there are legitimate questions about why this didn't happen sooner. I think that's a legitimate question. But I think that, I would not characterize all of these indictments in different jurisdictions to be election interference. What they are is what appears to be some very serious accusations backed up by evidence.
And in fact, the Washington Post did an investigation recently showing that the DOJ didn't really seriously investigate Trump's role in these alleged schemes until a year after January 6th, citing perhaps they were worried about the political implications. Does that hamper this case at all, that it did take so long for this investigation to even get started?
I think it does, because I think that, in the end of the day, first of all, Jack Smith may have made decisions in this case with that in mind. In other words, with the calendar in mind, making, for example, charging a more narrow case than he otherwise could have. But secondly, it creates this argument in this issue where there would have been none if they had started earlier. In other words, we wouldn't even be talking about an election, interference. I'm sure Trump could make that argument, but it would be a less powerful argument if, he had been indicted a year ago, for example.
And we've seen that Trump has used these indictments in the past to really fuel his political campaign, and it certainly is a messaging strategy that has resonated with his supporters. But then you see Trump as a defendant calling the prosecutor deranged. He's called on his supporters kind of in vague coded language to quote-unquote do something. How much leeway does he have to say these kinds of things before a judge views this as problematic to public safety?
Well, that's an interesting question. That's a challenging one for me to answer. It depends on the judge. I think a judge is going to give him some latitude to comment on these charges. After all, he was the president of the United States. He's been charged. He has a First Amendment right to speak his mind. But if the judge is convinced at a certain point that he's trying to tamper with the jury pool, the judge might sort of, interject herself into that in a certain respect and try to, admonish Trump and his attorneys and potentially take further steps. But she's got to be pretty careful because obviously his First Amendment rights, and she has to balance that against, other factors that might be there, like for example, trying to influence potential jurors.
Always a balancing act, and I remember those discussions happening when former Governor Rod Blagojevich was going through his cases here in Chicago. Renato Mariotti, always great analysis. Great to see you. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
And now to Brandis with some more of today's top stories.
In Paris, Northwestern University is bringing in a former U.S. Attorney General to investigate its handling of the widespread hazing scandal engulfing its athletics department. The university says Loretta Lynch, who is now with a private law firm in New York, will lead the independent review of the school's existing processes for detecting, reporting, and responding to potential misconduct in the NU athletics programs. Lynch previously served as former President Obama's second Attorney General and was in charge of the Department of Justice when it entered into a consent decree to reform the Chicago Police Department. Since the Northwestern hazing scandal broke, multiple players have filed suit against the school, and several coaches have been fired. In a statement, attorneys representing some of those players questioned why the initial investigation, which led to the firing of Coach Pat Fitzgerald, wasn't enough and why it hasn't been released. You can visit our website for a timeline of this investigation. And something fishy is happening at the Shed Aquarium. Shed leaders, dignitaries, and of course some of its favorite residents were on hand to unveil new plans for its 8-year, $500 million transformation project. The plans include a remodel of the aquarium's main entrance, new immersive exhibits and animal habitats, and more educational programs. The shed says it hopes to complete the project in phases by 2030, in time for its centennial celebration.
By modernizing and enhancing the aquarium experience, the shed expects to bring tens of thousands of more visitors to our city every single year. That economic impact is what helps the city invest in its people to further our commitment to make sure that communities across this city are fully supported.
And while the new sign may be temporary, the National Monument designation for Roberts Temple Church of God in Christ is permanent. Officials unveiled the sign today after President Joe Biden just last week created the Emmett Till and Mamie Till Mobley National Monument.
There's also a story within the story of Emmett Till, a story of social justice and the need thereof, a story of racial reconciliation and the need thereof, a story of a family's attempt to change the narrative from hatred and lynching to a narrative that challenges America to change.
The Till family gathered along with the U.S. Secretary of the Interior and multiple elected officials to unveil the sign at the church where thousands of mourners viewed Till's maimed body after his lynching in Mississippi in 1955. The monument also includes 2 other locations in Mississippi where his body was found and the courthouse where his killers were tried but not convicted. Up next, creating more protections for temporary workers right after this.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Alexandra and John Nichols, the Jim and Kay Mabey family, the Polk Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors.
Around 800,000 Illinoisans are working in temporary jobs, according to industry estimates. That's more than double over the last 2 decades. Those temps often don't know where they'll be working from one day to the next or if they'll be working. And it's a group of workers that advocates say are more vulnerable to harassment and abuse, including so-called permatemping, where workers are held back from getting hired full-time. As Chicago Tonight's Nick Blumberg reports, a bill awaiting the governor's signature aims to create new protections for temps.
Jose Frausto says temporary work is supposed to be just that, temporary. But he says many Illinois companies have created what advocates call permatemps.
A lot of these workers are being working in these companies for 5, 10, some people over 15 years as temp workers.
At the end of their term, Frausto says the worker gets fired and then promptly rehired, often into the same role, to ensure they remain classified as temporary.
Now it's after 90 days, temp workers are going to have the right to become permanent workers for the company.
With pay and benefits equal to full-time employees, a way to incentivize companies to hire the temps as staff. That's just one part of a measure lawmakers in Springfield passed during the spring session. The bill also mandates new safety standards. Advocates say temp workers often have little or no training on potentially dangerous equipment in warehouses or factories.
They've left me working 3 machines at once without any training. They don't tell me how to turn off the machinery or if it gets stuck, what I have to do.
And for temp worker Brisa Chavez and many others, there's a language barrier and what advocates say is a pattern of exploitation.
Most of the workers that fill up the temp work industry, you know, they're black and brown. Many of these, especially amongst the Latino community, the ones that I represent, tend to be undocumented. I think that for the most part, it's corporations trying to make sure they can get labor as cheap as possible.
While industry groups ended up neutral on the bill, the American Staffing Association sent WTTW News a letter it wrote to Governor J.B. Pritzker outlining its concerns. Quote, to ensure that affected staffing agencies understand the criteria the state will use in implementing the equal pay provisions, we request that enforcement of those provisions be stayed until final regulations are issued.
Staffing agencies are trying to connect people to work, but what we're attacking is perma-temping.
For its part, a representative of the Staffing Services Association of Illinois echoed the concerns about the equal pay provision and added, quote, "Illinois already has one of the toughest laws in the country protecting staffing workers, something our organizations worked on and implemented. There are very few complaints filed with the state against any of our members." But worker advocates say an understaffed Department of Labor can't keep up with enforcing existing protections.
They were just severely understaffed, and that for the whole state that they only have a handful of investigators.
Another key provision of the bill, allowing worker centers and other advocacy groups to help people who make allegations of harassment, abuse, wage theft, or discrimination.
They really mistreated people.
Norman Green says he's been working as a temp for almost 20 years. He was part of the lobbying effort to get the new protections for temps passed.
They be saying that you need to be there early, sign your name first, and you go out and get work. And I do them things and still wasn't getting work, so it was like real hard. I got 8 kids at home.
Green hopes new protections and more robust enforcement will be a boon to the hundreds of thousands of temps like him across the state.
If a person come in and bust their butt at work, let them work. Don't judge us for our skin color or mistreat of women.
Que no aguanten abusos, porque al aguantarse esos abusos.
You don't have to put up with that abuse. It eventually starts affecting your personal life. You start to bring all that weight home.
For Chicago Tonight, I'm Nick Blumberg.
And the bill is awaiting Governor Pritzker's signature. It'll automatically become law on August 15th unless Pritzker vetoes the measure. And up next, why Illinois is leading the country with most tornadoes. But first, we look at the weather.
Illinois has seen 107 tornadoes in the year 2023. That makes it the state with the most tornadoes this year. But scientists caution, though, the thought of adding the Prairie State to Tornado Alley. Joining us to explain why that is are Colby Hunt, McDonough County Farm Bureau President, Trent Ford, Illinois State climatologist, and Paul Servatka, Professor of Meteorology at the College of DuPage in Wheaton. Gentlemen, welcome back. Thank you for joining us. Paul Servatka, what's your reaction to Illinois leading the country with the most tornadoes so far this year?
Well, based on a lot of things this year, it doesn't surprise me. Illinois is a state that gets a variety of numbers of tornadoes. Some years are very lean and others are very abundant. This happens to be one of them, but that's also coupled with other states that we normally think of as Tornado Alley states, not getting many tornadoes.
Trent, why caution, though, the idea of Illinois becoming part of, what is typically the states that are typically considered Tornado Alley?
Well, I mean, first of all, the idea of Tornado Alley is a bit antiquated anywhere, maybe a bit of a misnomer, because when it comes to the frequency of tornadoes, the Southeast and the Midwest get a lot of tornadoes as well. And actually, when we look at injuries and fatalities, the Southeast U.S., think about Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, even up to Southern Illinois, lead as far as the impacts of tornadoes. So, when we just focus on Tornado Alley, like Texas, Kansas, Oklahoma, that's where some of the big wedge tornadoes and the bright pictures come from. But tornadoes are definitely a hazard here in the Midwest and the Southeast as well.
What would you say is driving the number of tornadoes that we've seen this year, Trent?
Yeah, so the large number of tornadoes first started off in the wintertime. Now, I say really cautiously, we don't have a tornado season in Illinois, but peak frequency is somewhere between April and June typically. And usually January and February are kind of off times for tornado frequency. But this year we had a significant tornado outbreak in central Illinois in January, pretty high tornado frequency in February, and then a huge outbreak in March, actually record-breaking for March as far as the number of tornadoes. And that just catapulted us to actually the first 3 months of the year, we surpassed our normal total annual average of right around 54 tornadoes. And then April, May, and June together, as well as July, have been close, if not a little bit more active than normal. So that puts us up in the top, 3 to 5 as far as total number of tornadoes.
Colby Hunt, your farm has been hit with high winds and storms. Tell us a little bit about what happened, please.
Yeah, on June 29th, we got hit by the derecho. Came through, it was 100 mile an hour sustained winds. We lost some grain bins, Corn was laid over, and lots of sheds and houses damaged. Our little town lost a lot of trees, and it was a pretty big deal.
What would you say, like when you talk about losing grain bins like that, what's the financial impact? What's the hit?
So to replace the 2 grain bins we lost were $130,000 a piece. I figure our farm sustained around $400,000 worth of damage total.
Okay. Paul Servatka, you've also sort of cautioned about how we count a tornado and what, the number of tornadoes that are sort of an EF0 counting towards that total.
Right. In the past 15, 20 years, we have really gotten much better at identifying what we think are now these weaker tornadoes, especially tornadoes that are not associated with individual isolated storms like we may think of in the plains, as Trent mentioned, but along lines of storms. And so as we go into June and July, we start getting more and more frequency of lines of storms that create these what we call quasi-linear convective system tornadoes. They're really hard to identify. They spin up really quickly, and usually the winds of the line itself are strong. The tornado increases a small region of damage.
Okay. Trent, is this, part of a larger trend in the frequency of tornadoes?
Well, this is a tough question because, historically, kind of what Paul mentioned, if we go back 40, 50 years ago, we undercounted a lot of the smaller tornadoes just because if they were off somewhere that we didn't have a whole lot of population, we may have missed them. So, when we look at the historical record, we can really only go back to maybe the 1980s and certainly the 1990s to start seeing about a tornado frequency. So it's really challenging to say, okay, is what we're seeing a higher frequency? And then I think more importantly, if we go into the future, are we going to see higher frequency of tornadoes? The state-of-the-art research, some of which is done right here in Illinois on that, does suggest that we may see an increased frequency of at least tornado days, kind of these outbreak days like what we've seen this year in a couple of different spots, but it's really uncertain. No matter what, we always like to talk about the frequency of tornadoes, but as our urban areas expand physically, geographically, it does put areas in a higher risk of being hit by a tornado with or without some sort of increasing trend. So that's, I think, an important point to make as well.
Colby, you mentioned, the amount of damage to the grain bins that you lost and some structures being lost. What kind of impact could storms like this and this particular storm season have on a farmer's harvest?
Yeah, so the storm was fortunate enough that I think it hit at a time where farmers can buy new equipment to harvest if they did have equipment damaged, but it is kind of tight. We're still under some supply chain issues, left over from COVID or whatever the case may be. So, replacing those structures like the grain bins we lost, they're supposed to be delivered in September, the new ones, and whether they can get put up by the time we complete harvest and allow us to fill them, that's yet to be seen. So just the timing of getting the replacement equipment in is what's key right now.
Okay, and what does that mean for you? If it doesn't make it in time, or what could happen? What's the end result?
I mean, you could always borrow neighbors. I'm not concerned. I think we'll be able to find it. If the bins don't happen to be constructed, we can deliver it. There's some pricing issues with that, we'll find a way.
Okay, and Trent, we've got about a minute left. What role does climate change have in this tornado pattern?
Yeah, so this is the idea of looking at projections forward, and it is really uncertain. But like I mentioned, the research does suggest that that climate change may affect tornado frequency in the Southeast and the Midwest, and we may see an increase in these number of tornado days. Whether that means more intense tornadoes or weaker tornadoes is still unclear, but there's a lot more research to be done. Tornadoes are hard to observe, let alone model with our giant global models. So there's a lot more work that needs to be done to better understand at what risk we're seeing with these increased frequency and what risk we're putting ourselves in with the development.
Okay, that's where we'll have to leave it. I'm sure, gentlemen, you'll all be keeping an eye on it for us. Paul Servatka, Trent Ford, and Colby Hunt, thanks for joining us. And we're back to wrap things up right after this.
Where have we been? Where are we at? Where are we going? essentially to be able to help anyone and everyone in the community, whether that's through academic support, social emotional learning, or just providing a safe space for youth to be able to be there.
This is the fabric of the neighborhood. You need to take care of the neighborhood. It's an ecosystem.
And that's our show for this Tuesday night. Don't forget to stay connected with us by signing up for our daily briefing. And you can get Chicago Tonight streamed on Facebook, YouTube, and our website, WTTW.com/news.
You can also get the show via podcast and the PBS video app. And join us tomorrow night at 5:30 and 10. Thousands of CPS students won't have a school bus service for the start of the new school year amid a nationwide driver shortage.
And the Loop has that sinking feeling, what Northwestern researchers discovered about what's happening beneath downtown's surface. Now, for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Brandis Friedman.
And I'm Paris Schutz. Thank you for watching. Stay healthy and safe. Have a great evening.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a personal injury law firm pleased to give back to the community through numerous charitable initiatives.